Today we're going to start working on independent and dependent variables. The first thing that we have to understand is that by working on the foundational skills, we have to know what independent means and what dependent means. We're also going to need to know that the first coordinate, the x, think about our coordinate plane, x and y. And an ordered pair is the independent, so that's going to be the x. And then the y coordinate is usually the dependent. Okay, that's going to be super important for the rest of our targets on this. So that's just kind of a quick introduction. So the level 2 on this is super simple, but also can be super difficult. It's really just knowing what independent and dependent is, but the practicing of that can be tricky. So we're going to use this fill in the blank after we read. The variable, remember that's a letter, that represents the independent quantity is called the independent variable. And the variable that represents the dependent quantity is called the dependent variable. So what we have to understand is that dependent means that it depends or changes because of something else. That something else in math is the independent variable. You've heard of this kind of in science a little bit too. So let's take a closer look at what independent. Now, most of you guys, want to think about being independent, which means you can do things on your own, right? So this is the thing that changes and makes, let's say, and controls the answer. Okay. The dependent would be the answer. Okay. It would be the outcome. Okay. If you think about if you had a machine that created something, I like to use potato chips as an example. It starts out as a potato. So the potato would be independent. We put that into the machine. A lot of different changes happens to it. And then the dependent is that potato chip that comes out. So maybe the dependent could change depending on the flavoring, that independent profile that we're putting on the potato. So maybe it's sour cream and onion. So that's going to change the dependent. What comes out of the end of that potato chip machine depends on what we're putting into it. And maybe that's a way that you can kind of think about it. N, okay, that's what you're putting into it. So that's what you're controlling. And then the D, this is dependent on what's going into it. Okay. So we're going to fill in the blanks here to practice these vocabulary words. A variable that changes in response to change in another variable. That's going to be the dependent. Okay, let's talk about why. Well, the first reason why is it changes in response. That means something else is controlling it. What's controlling it? The independent item. Okay. Blank variables that have values that change. There's that word, that change again, due to other factors. Well, these other factors, they're not in control. Okay. So this has to be dependent. While blank variables have values that do not rely on anything else. Okay, if you're independent, then you do not rely on anything else. You can take care of everything by yourself, your bills, getting yourself to school, all the different things. I am not spelling independent right here, so let me fix that. Independent. That looks better. Now, here's where you get to be creative. Describe a scenario that would have an independent and dependent variable. So mine, and you don't have to write this down, this is just my example, is a cat and myself. Okay, so I'm just going to tell you my scenario. The cat is dependent okay? Because myself, me, is independent. Independent. Ooh, I'm really struggling with that. Because the cat is dependent on me for what? For food and water. Okay. So you're just going to pause and write a couple of sentences here about something other than a cat and yourself that would maybe illustrate independent and dependent. This is going to help you remember. I'm going to keep moving and go on to our level 3. Now, our level 3 is being able to take an example here and figure out what two quantities are changing and then what quantity depends on the other. And this will help us decide what's independent and dependent. So let's read this first scenario. You have cookies for your team pool party, but you don't know how many of your teammates will show up. How many cookies will each teammate receive if everyone receives the same number of cookies? So can you hear the two things that are changing? Sounds like the number of cookies and the number of teammates. We don't know how many people are going to come. Okay. Now we have to figure out which one depends on the other. Well, it says, how many cookies will each teammate receive if everyone receives the same? So that means the amount of cookies is depending on how many teammates show up. So the number of cookies depends on the number of teammates. I mean, think about it. I go to the store, I buy a certain amount of cookies, and so I know that when those cookies are gone, they're gone. Okay. Once I can say what depends on the other, that tells me the independent and dependent. Okay. Take a look at how I did that. Pause if you need to. I'm going to go ahead and move on to the next one. Fish tank. You are draining a 200-gallon fish tank at a rate of 10 gallons per minute. How much water remains in the tank at a specific time? So I can hear the amount of water at a specific time. So the two things that are changing are going to be, how do we measure the amount of water? Well, it looks like it's going to be in gallons. How do we measure the time? It looks like it's in minutes. Okay. Sometimes it's helpful to draw a picture. I have this fish tank with 200 gallons of water and it's draining 10 gallons per minute. Okay. So what depends on the other? Well, it's asking me how much water remains. If you take a look at this, it says how many cookies. So the cookies depends on the teammates. So here, what's going to depend? The water depends on how much time has gone by. Doesn't that make sense? How long you let this drain is going to affect how much water's in it. So gallons, because that's what we're measuring the water in, depends on minutes. Okay, so the independent would be the minutes. And I'm going to give you a hint here in just a moment that's going to really help you on these. Dependent is the gallons. Okay, I'm going to change this to red because it's really important. Time, okay, is always independent. Okay, I don't know what you have to do to remind yourself, but if time is in your scenario at all, it's always going to be your independent variable. Okay, now I'm going to go ahead and end the video now because I want you to just try to do this. There's about 4 practice problems here. Okay, on the next 2 slides. So I want you to go ahead and see what you can do on your own. Good luck.